There's a quote in this kind of obscure movie, Mr. Brooks, in which Kevin Costner tells Dane Cook, wow, remember Dane Cook? You always want to invest in things people can't do without. Water and cemeteries. Pretty safe bets. Is that true? Is a cemetery a safe bet investment? Well, I'm not qualified to offer investment advice, and I don't want you to just go out and buy a cemetery and then sue me when you have trouble filling it up. So, no. But this raises some good questions. How do cemeteries make enough money to continue operating perpetually? Is that even a goal, to operate perpetually? What happens when a cemetery is full? What are the responsibilities cemeteries and communities have to each other? What role do cemeteries play in shaping the social construct of death? What is the future of cemeteries in our culture? This is the economics and social construct of cemeteries, Dansplained. Let's start at the beginning of the end. As the population in Europe grew through the 18th and 19th centuries, church graveyards began to overfill as a natural result of, if there are more people, there will be more dead people. That's just generally how people work. Because the graveyards were over capacity, local authorities began to recognize a need for a public institution for interring the dead, and they made new laws accordingly. There was concern with disease, as the prominent understanding of germs at the time held that it would be dangerous to have overcrowded cemeteries due to the gases released by so many decomposing bodies in such a small area. These new laws did not go over well. In fact, there were literal riots in France in which the townspeople prevented the authorities from taking the dead to the cemetery on the outskirts of town. Eventually, the new cemeteries were accepted, and the culture around death and burial firmly shifted. To a large degree, the establishment of cemeteries wrested control of burial space from the church and redefined the provision of space for interment as a civic rather than spiritual responsibility. Up until the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris was established in 1804, graveyards had served a specific function of helping a body decompose so that the bones could be exhumed and placed in an ossuary. Then room could be made for the next body. With Père Lachaise, a new era of garden cemeteries began, in which loved ones could visit their deceased relatives' final resting place, and picnicking in cemeteries became a popular activity. The cemeteries were the closest thing to a park that many people had access to, especially in the city. The pleasant designs of the headstones, beautiful statues, and the park-like landscaping enticed people into the tranquil setting. Eventually, large crowds and litters spoiled this practice, and cemeteries began to control and restrict access and activities on the grounds. As a result, our cultural connection to cemeteries shifted to what many of us experience today. It's a place we go to bury the dead initially and visit briefly on special dates, but typically a place we avoid. Now back to interrogating this Mr. Brooks thesis of cemeteries as a safe bet investment. Since cemeteries have shifted to a model of perpetual interment, you can easily recognize that the business will eventually or even quickly run out of products to sell. Once the dead are buried, it would be a bad look for a cemetery to disinter their body if the surviving friends and family stopped paying the cemetery. So relying on an ongoing rent system is a little uncouth, though there are some places where that occurs. Charging enough to cover the costs of maintenance into infinity would be 1. Possible to calculate, and 2. Exorbitantly, inaccessibly expensive. Say that 5 times fast. Exorbitantly, inaccessibly expensive. Exorbitantly, inaccessibly expensive. Exorbitantly, inaccessibly expensive. So where is the balance? And how do cemeteries provide a service that lasts forever without charging ongoing payments or a wildly inflated price? The answer, as with most everything, lies in capitalism. In many states and municipalities, cemeteries are required to put enough of the plot payment into a trust called a perpetual care fund. This is just like a retirement account where you or I would stash away money in the expectation we'll someday pull money back out of it and live mostly off the interest it accrues over many decades. Eventually, the cemetery will sell all its plots and there will be no more initial payments going into that trust. At that point, the operation shifts primarily to maintenance of the grounds. As you might imagine, the funds the trust builds probably won't grow at a rate that outpaces operational expenses once there are no more plot purchases coming in. This arrangement is done strategically to provide a couple generations worth of funds so that the cemetery can keep the grounds maintained long enough for the descendants of the buried dead to just not really care anymore. Like all businesses, cemeteries have an imperative to continue operating and producing a profit infinitely. So at this point, they're faced with a choice to either wind down operations and close the cemetery, or to find creative ways to continue providing a profitable service for death. Profitable service for death, yeah. Some cemeteries have adapted by hosting tours and music events to provide both a leisure space to the community and a source of income to offset costs for maintaining the grounds. But what happens when a cemetery fills up, largely stops being visited, and runs out of money in its perpetual care fund? Do the dead have rights to continue being interred in that place? Do the distant relatives of the dead have rights to that land? What responsibility does the cemetery organization have to the community at that point? When does a cemetery cease to be a cemetery? Louisiana law states that after property is dedicated to cemetery purposes pursuant to this chapter, neither the dedication nor the title of the plot owner shall be affected by the dissolution of the cemetery authority, by non-use on its part, by alienation of the property, or otherwise. If a cemetery hosts graves of famous historical figures, the community may have an interest in keeping that cemetery open. In some instances, a city may even allow the removal of remains and redevelopment of the land. Of course, due to space constraints in Europe, graves historically were never considered permanent resting places, unless you were rich. There are always different rules for the rich. There are always different rules for the rich. The cemetery became an important vehicle through which people were able to construct identities and convey the meaning of their lives to others. Thus, it became important in a society hyper-focused on status to secure permanent resting places for oneself and one's relatives. And of course, scrupulous entrepreneurs exploited this social fact. Space is an intricate web of social relationships. Space is production. Space produces. The public cemetery as planned space is no different. The cemetery does not simply catch the dead. The cemetery rather contributes to the very construction of what it means to be dead. Perhaps we should return to the concept that burial in a specific place should be temporary, and give that land back to those who arrive at death after us. Perhaps we should maintain our reverence for the dead and protect that land in perpetuity, bearing the cost of interring our ancestors as a community. Perhaps we should construct whole new norms and laws surrounding cemeteries and what to do with the dead, with considerations of space and the environment for future generations. In the meantime, perhaps cemeteries should be public or religious institutions, which hold the tension of individual and family desires for what to do with the dead, and community desires for appropriate use of land and the social construct of death. Perhaps burial of the dead shouldn't be an investment opportunity at all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, copy the link and send it to a buddy. Smash that like button and subscribe to this channel.